Good afternoon and welcome to the second event in our series exploring the Planning White Paper. My name is Katja Stille and I'm the incoming chair of the UDG and director for Tibet's Planning and Urban Design. Last week we talked about the role of strategic planning, and today we will explore the opportunities and challenges of using digital tools to inform local plans and individual applications. The Planning White Paper sets out to streamline and modernize the planning process, to improve outcomes on design and sustainability and ensure more land is available for development and that this land is in the right locations. So how will the use of GIS and other digital tools help achieve the government goals? And above all, I think a keen interest for all of us, help create better places, better designed places, and also ensure that places kind of last longer. So I think the COVID pandemic has fast-tracked our virtual communication and the use of digital tools. There's no doubt that we have to find ways of engaging better virtually and that we need local plan processes that are more accessible to everyone. In particularly in light of the proposals within the white paper, where much more emphasis is put on the local plan and the definition of land within those early stages of the planning process. We also need a planning process that provides more certainty, and the white paper sets out the ambition to have a rule-based system based on data rather than documents. So how does that relate to the desire of creating beautiful places? How can the use of digital tools help create and assess quality? Today, we have 4 speakers that will share their thoughts, and I'm sure the audience will have plenty to add to that. I'm really keen that we have plenty of time for discussion. So without further delay, I would say we just start with the speakers and then have a really good discussion afterwards as we go along. So first of all, we will hear from Sue James, and she will explain and share her vision for a GIS-enabled planning system. Sue is a founding member of the Tree and Design Action Group and has also advised Future Build, formerly EcoBuild, for many years, and has been working hard to kind of support a collaborative and collaborative process across all sectors. So I think, Sue, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Katja. And thank you, Robert and Urban Design Group, for inviting me to take part in this session. I mean, not least because I am the least technologically or digitally inspired or competent person you could have thought of. But I do think the Planning White Paper has created an opportunity which we just need to grasp and find ways of making it work. And before I launch into my specific topic, I just wanted to reiterate some of the points made last week, in which planning's in a really good position to deliver. Essentially, our actions and decision-making, including where and what to build, and even if we should build, must be in the context of responding to the climate and ecological emergency, delivering the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because that is actually a government commitment, and meeting the needs of future generations. Now, Wales has its Future Generations Act. There's a bill going through the UK Parliament. But apart from legislation, we just all need to start being good ancestors, to quote Roman Krznaric, because the subtitle of his book is How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. So what I want to now talk about as to why I think what I'm going to suggest is a good starting point is because we do need to bear in mind this long-term thinking and take a lot of ideas into account at once. So we have an opening that planning decisions, should be based on data and evidence. So a very good starting point is, what do we actually have? What have we got there on the ground? The Planning White Paper has also expressed an enthusiasm for digitization. So could we be a little bit more ambitious? Could we have a national land use framework, or whatever we want to call it, for England? I mean, we have them in Wales, we have them in Scotland, we don't have this in England. And there are a lot of data sets available. They're more probably in development. We can digitize information and map across the natural, economic, social, cultural environment, so we know what we have over a range of critical issues. And then we can add layers to identify, areas of conflict, where there are opportunities, and generally support evidence-based planning and decision-making. And that way, at least, we might avoid some of the very obvious pitfalls like development in floodplains, no access to public transport or services, outside areas of employment, in areas of water shortages, or even on prime agricultural land, because clearly, we can't forget soil, food, water. This is what we all depend on. So the next question is, which I hope the technical people here can answer, is what would the brief be for such a framework? I mean, there are huge inefficiencies in working between different authorities and organizations with different mapping standards, policy objectives, databases, records of land ownership, asset locations. It doesn't only make holistic policy making difficult, but it's sort of economically very inefficient. So there's a lot of information out there. The information needs to be open data, open source, not in proprietary formats, so that it's possible to use applications that provide the user with the maps and the graphical representations that can work together, so that we can layer obvious kind of things to, as I say, check where it's appropriate and where it isn't in terms of planning decisions. Let's not forget too that it's only 8 to 10% of the of England that's classified as urban. So, but much of what happens in the other 90% is actually really relevant for urban resilience. I mean, an obvious one is upper catchment water management. And we also have to remember that, shockingly, the UK has been described as one of the most nature deprived, depleted countries in the world. So the digital land use framework would not only deliver a better, more informed and more joined up planning process, but I see it also as a vital tool in addressing the wider climate and biodiversity emergency, which, putting COVID to one side, is actually a really big challenge. So has the time come, Wei Yang pointed it out last week, to consider the whole territory as an integrated entity, know what we have, and know what we're dealing with, so that we're not sort of in the dark with areas that don't really join up. So my proposal is we need to tie together government departments to deliver a proactive strategic planning system, and this land use framework provides an evidence space for doing this. So over to the tech team to tell me how to achieve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sue. I think that's provided a really good introduction and kind of starting point for the discussion. I particularly like the kind of thought of having a national land use framework, because I think that will certainly help us to identify the locations where we need to build and line it up with employment and all the other factors. And I think that is one of the very, very big elements that is missing currently. Absolutely. I think another point, really good point, is kind of that sharing of data. I mean, I've been thinking kind of in preparation for this and through the years of working on planning applications, like any planning application creates so much data, surveys, studies, and then the site next to it does it all again, although often they overlap, and all this data isn't shared, isn't open. And I think we have so much of it. It's partly because of warranties and who owns those the data, i.e. the developers. But I think if we could make that open and shared, we would be so rich in terms of the information and understand our world much better.
Can I pop one thing into that question? This other consultation on transparency and competence, or whatever it is that something that would actually help make data more open source, land use, ownership and all those things? I just put that in as a...
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure we come back to these points in the discussion. So our next speaker will be Chris Sharp from Holistic City Software. And he will kind of talk a little bit about his understanding of the planning white paper and the digital futures within it. Chris is a city design consultant with an interest in the potential of technology to help design successful new cities. He has co-founded Holistic City Software with the aim of creating digital tools to help us urban designers and other kind of professions to create better urban environments. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Katja, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I think my job is to kind of give a quick summary of what the white paper actually says, and I'll start sharing my presentation. And okay, great. So to start with, I think it's always interesting to look at how many times a word appears in a white paper. And so in this one, planning is mentioned over 400 times, which is fair enough. The word development is mentioned 271 times. So that's obviously an important theme. The word digital appears 51 times, which is actually quite a lot. And so although the digital side of things is a bit hidden beneath the headline proposals, the ideas on digital planning and data reform are actually a very significant recurring theme throughout the document. You'll also see that the phrase urban design doesn't appear at all, which is obviously outrageous, and I hope they'll sort that out. But going on to, as a very quick summary, I think you mentioned this before, the key sentence is that they're looking for a reformed system that is based upon data rather than documents. So what does that actually mean? I think everybody knows what a system based on documents looks like, whether it's documents in planning applications or very long local plan documents. But what does a system based on data look like? And I think to try and describe this, we need to see data as the key to everything. So I put data in the center. So the white paper talks about modularity, which from a software technology point of view is a very sensible and a very powerful approach. And the idea is that if the data in the middle is standardized and published in an open, accessible, and well-documented way, then it can be used and consumed by a whole ecosystem of software tools and apps. And the white paper mentions a few of these, and I'll go through them quickly now. The obvious one is an interactive web-based map showing spatial policies and other features on a map of the area. The white paper makes a big thing about civic engagement, broadening that out. And so new digital tools will access the data on policies. It also mentions greater use of social media in plan making. And I've got some concerns about that, but I'm sure we might get onto that later in the discussion. But we know that that's an important part of it. It also talks about modernizing the tools used for making applications, improving the user experience, and looking at the process of managing planning applications. The white paper says it wants to make it easier for anyone to identify what can be built where. And that's something of interest to us as a software company, because if we can quickly access what sort of development is permitted in one place, then we can feed that back. So if somebody's creating a 3D model of the master plan, we can then in real time warn people if what they're doing isn't policy compliant in terms of building heights or land use or anything else. It also mentions an interesting point about, because the data is standardized, and this goes back to what Sue was saying, that if the data is standardized in a particular format in all planning areas, then it makes it easier to look at cross-boundary issues, and the white paper suggests assessing local infrastructure needs. They also describe how applications and decisions and developer contributions and all kinds of other data sets will be published in an open way. Which opens up all kinds of opportunities on monitoring things like housing delivery and making it quicker and cheaper to get insight into patterns of development at all scales. And lastly, and Katja, you mentioned that the problem people do surveys might have to do the same sort of survey over and over again. The white paper actually mentions that they're looking at ways of updating or reusing information so that to reduce the need for doing that over and over again. But the key point here is that the data is central, and the principle of open data is that the government can't predict all of the ways people might want to use the data. So by publishing it, they can let people use it any way they want, and also combine it with other data sets. So obviously a council might produce an interactive map, but it would also be a possibility for somebody else to produce an interactive map that might explain the policies in a better way. So it opens the possibility to all kinds of innovation. And obviously by standardizing the format, it makes it, these tools can be used anywhere in the country. You don't need to develop a different one for each area. In terms of specific actions, the white paper talks about standardizing and opening up the data, which is obviously a very big job. It mentions a series of pilots working with local authorities, particularly in the community engagement area, and also mentions new templates for planning notices, smaller applications, and repeats their support for a UK PropTech or Property Technology Innovation Council. So what might all this look like? My time's nearly up, but this is a digital zoning plan published by the City of Berlin. There are obviously several different land uses. I know in the UK, they're talking about just 3 categories, the protected, renewal and growth. And in reality, we might end up with a more sophisticated categorization, something like this. But Berlin is also interesting because the city recently published a 3D model of all of the buildings in the city, which anyone can use. And there are obviously lots of 3D models used in the UK, but that's mainly private sector led. So it will be interesting to see whether 3D modeling will be part of this opening up of data, particularly with the value that could bring to public consultations. So just to summarize, I think overall, the proposals are good. I think that they've understood the potential for the principles of open data and modularity to make things better. I know there's lots of questions on the planning side of things, and there are people in this meeting who are much better qualified than me to comment on that. But certainly from a digital point of view, it looks like a good start. And if it's implemented sensibly, it should open up a lot of possibilities for everyone in the process. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that overview. I mean, really helpful summary of what the white paper says. And to say a lot of opportunities. We need to, as with a lot of aspects in the white paper, figure out the detail and how to actually put it into practice. I mean, just quick glance, there are already questions about data hygiene. How do we kind of keep them data up to date, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure we talk about that maybe in a little bit more detail later. I mean, I'm also kind of, obviously, your example from Berlin. And I mean, I think that is one thing that in Germany, there is a common language across the country of how every plan looks like, a common key, common colors. And that certainly makes it much easier for people to kind of learn how to engage with it, because they kind of need to learn the language once and then they know what it means. So I think that could certainly help in terms of making plans more accessible across the country. And I think 3D modeling as well. I mean, at the moment we're in situations where a lot of planning applications don't even include a street section or the kind of topography of the site. So I think there's a long way to go. But I'm sure we will get there. So lots of food for thought, which we will explore a bit later. So our next speaker is Leslie Howson from Urban Design Solutions, and he's talking about the attitudes towards a digital future for planning. Leslie is a registered architect and urban designer, and has an Edinburgh-based urban design practice, working for local authorities, developers, community councils, and community groups. So I think he will tell us about some of the kind of practical implications and issues about using the digital tools. So over to Leslie.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. I'm, as you said, I'm an architect, designer.
Oh, Leslie, you are freezing. Your line isn't. Oh, now you. Oh.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. You may, let's try, but if the line doesn't improve, you may have to switch off your video to get the line a bit better. But let's have a go.
Right. Okay, I don't know how much of that you heard, but the importance to me of 3D modeling as a design communication tool. In the title of this talk today, of the webinar today, we're saying the planning white paper proposes a revolution in the way planning is undertaken and an end to the era of notices stuck on lampposts and a comprehensive use of digital technology. For quite some time, I felt that 3D modeling, CAD modeling, isn't used sufficiently in the planning process. When you make a submission, there's no requirement for CAD modeling. There tends to be, we still seem to work on the basis of 2D drawings when it comes to communicating with planning, communicating with councillors, communicating with community groups. We seem to be still, certainly in Edinburgh where I am, still working on the basis of 2D drawings. I decided I wanted to write an article about this for Urban Realm, of which I'm one of the on the editorial group, and I decided that we needed surveys. So there was, the first survey was through the Urban Design Group, and the results of that were published on Urban Update. The immediate response, though a small sample at this early stage, was illuminating and surprising. Of those urban design members who replied, 30% use 3D CAD on a regular basis, 22% consider 3D imagery an essential part of their planning submission, and just under half respondents find that local authorities expect or insist on 3D presentations. We didn't have much of a response from Scottish local authorities, so I carried out a separate survey direct to a selection of 19 of the Scottish local authorities. There were 32 local authorities in Scotland, and again the response was good and positive, and the conclusion was that there is support certainly among practitioners and among many local authorities for greater use of 3D CAD for communicating. And to me, the communication, important communication, certainly where I work, the areas I work, is communicating with, firstly, clients, with planning officers, with communities and with councillors. There is a small video which I think is going to come on screen soon. I don't know who's going to put that on the screen for me.
Leslie, Jacqueline here. I'm going to do that for you, so just give me a second, okay?
This was a very quick model that was produced literally within hours for a meeting, an initial meeting with a community group and a developer to start to explore how a site could be developed. It was a brownfield site covering the area of the proposed site is in the area where the model is in pink, and I was trying to encourage them that in the communication process we have in Edinburgh, that between developers and local community groups, we have what's called the Concordat in Edinburgh. And I felt that the communication process would be better if 3D modeling was used right from the outset. And that was just to show an example of a 3D model that could be used and that the community could interact with, and it would be used from the very earliest stages of discussions. Eventually I wrote the article for Urban Realm, which you may or may not have seen, which really was a report on the findings from the two surveys. So that's part of which I've got to say initially. So.
Leslie, you've frozen again, unfortunately, but thank you for that. Oh, I think we might have lost you. I'm sure we will come back to this very important point about kind of using digital tools to communicate, particularly with the communities and the planning authorities. And I mean, there's certainly kind of, we have a very, very long way to go. And I think it also has to come together with a lot of training within local authorities, training within our profession, as well as training communities to read these models in the right way as a tool, rather than the kind of fully formulated kind of design, which they sometimes are interpreted to be. So let's hear from our last speaker, and then let's launch into the questions afterwards. So our next speaker is Liz Reynolds from Think Deep UK. And she is an urban planner, and her company Urban specializes in planning and design and problem solving for urban environments. And she has authored a study within Think Deep looking at how we can use the underground under our cities better to find creative ways for cities to better manage their natural resources and plan strategically for long-term change. So I'm pleased to hear from Liz. So let's go over to her.
Thanks, Katja. I'm just going to share my screen and then get started. Apologies for the noise in the background. I've got 2 calls going on, but I hope you can hear me. So let me just begin at the beginning, because that's the best place to start. The planning white paper contains 3 primary pillars, the third of which is planning for infrastructure and connected places. The government talks about the need to improve infrastructure delivery in all parts of the country and to ensure that developers play their part. However, in order for developers to play their part, they need to understand what's beneath their sites and in the land immediately surrounding it. They also need cost-effective ways of delivering new infrastructure. So today I'm going to talk through some initiatives in this space and some constraints, focusing on 3 areas. Firstly, beginning with what can be known as the archaeosphere. So when we think about cities, we think about a ground level, but what we don't think about is actually all the layers of recent and ancient human history that have built up a kind of half-life of objects. So there's the things that we believe to be there in terms of mythology, there's the things that are actually there in terms of archaeology, like the woolly mammoth that was found in Ilford. There's the London Mithras that sits below Bloomberg's current HQ. There's all the different hydrological and geological conditions. There's waste that's buried, whether it's toxic, or then there's actual human burials, as we've seen perhaps on the recent documentary around HS2 and the archaeology there. There's also a tangle of utilities and also major heavy infrastructure such as railway lines. So what we could talk about in this level is the archaeosphere, kind of urban archaeology. At the very top of the surface, if we're talking about the optical fibre connections that are needed to facilitate calls like today, or if we're talking about other telecommunications and energy infrastructure, whether it's from localised heat networks, we need an understanding of what's already there. Here's a couple of photos taken in my street about 6 months ago. In an attempt, I think this was to upgrade the water, but each utility provider works in their own way to map what they think sits below the surface of assets that they don't own. And you'll notice that there's lots of bright colours, there's lots of exclamation marks and lots of question marks, which are a little bit worrying. And I think that gives you a hint of the limited extent of information that people have available to them. So the British Geological Survey, the Ordnance Survey, and what was the Future Cities Catapult, and with that I've got to give credit to Stephanie Bricker from BGS, Rollo Home from the Ordnance Survey, and Stefan Webb from what was the Future Cities Catapult, which is now the combined catapult. undertook research into how you might integrate the available data that we do have on assets beneath our cities. And this is really important because accidental strikes on those assets that I showed you with those question marks cost the industry about £1.2 billion a year. So if we want developers to say that certain infrastructure is unviable to their scheme, we need to use data to make it as viable and as cost efficient as possible. So Project Iceberg attempted to, in its early stages, and this is an ongoing piece of research, but its first stage tried to create an integrated data platform, utilities data where subway infrastructure lies, the foundations and basements of buildings, which can be like icebergs beneath the surface of our cities. They also overlaid this with topographical and geotechnical data. And if you have a look for Project Iceberg online, you should be able to find out more about this. Another related initiative was the founding of a geospatial commission. And this was really to understand what assets the UK has, digital assets, in terms of infrastructure, and how to more coherently map these and communicate them. So quite recently, or in June this year, it's gone quite quickly, and the initial findings of a national underground asset register were released. And this is an ongoing project, which is also calling for case studies as well. And this attempts to map that tangle of things that I've talked about. Just quickly moving on, one other topic that I did want to talk about was sustainable drainage. So if we're going to try and meet some of those UN Sustainable Development Goals, providing cities that are hygienic, that are resilient, and that have a high ecological function is really important. This is a map of a project that we did with the British Geological Survey, and actually intended to explain to developers why it's really important to understand ground conditions before you start development on a site. Anecdotally, we've heard of large master plans obtaining planning consent, having a condition to attenuate water on site through their SUDS planning condition, and then realising they haven't left enough land available for that. And perhaps that's because the layout of the master plan hasn't considered the geological conditions beneath the site. So, and from that point, in order to attenuate all the flood water and to satisfy that condition, we have heard anecdotally of master plans having to be revised down and housing numbers having to drop, which causes you to go back through that, get a deed of variation and perhaps a Section 73 amendment to your permission. So it's a huge hassle. No one really wants to have to do that. So in trying to understand what's below the surface of your site and to deliver better infrastructure, I'd encourage you to look at the resources of the BGS as well. That's the final slide I've got for today, but I'm happy to talk about this topic for quite some time afterwards if anyone's interested. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Liz. I mean, every time, I've seen you speak about this before, and every time I'm really fascinated because it is such an important, but yet unfortunately also very ignored subject. And we all, on a day-to-day basis probably stumble over those issues, and they undermine the quality of our places. And we don't seem to get it right when we build brand new places either. So it's absolutely something we need to address. And I think it kind of leads us into almost the first question the white paper is quite broad about data, but what is actually the data that we need? And what is the most essential data that we need to kind of collect and, make public? And obviously there are big areas where we don't have the data, and how do we get to that data? Who's responsible for acquiring that data? Maybe can throw that the first question to the speakers really of what is the most essential data that we need to collect, and who do you think would be responsible to actually collecting that data and holding it? So I realized lots of questions kind of rolled into one, but does anyone want to come back on that?
Certainly with the CAD modelling data, every city should have a CAD model. Information should be available to developers and designers to access that model. There are a lot of city models which are underused. We have one in Edinburgh which is hardly used at all. I think it's an important that data is available and is used.
Yeah, so a 3D model needs to be kind of on top of the kind of validation list for any planning application that is coming forward, suitable to be plugged into that city.
It's about context. Every scheme, however, well, certainly what I call it impact, all high impact developments, but a lot of local developments can have quite an impact. And I think it's important that those are inserted into that model and that a dialogue starts at an early stage using those models.
Okay, yeah. Anyone else? So what's your thoughts?
So I don't think I'm really answering the question, but Liz as ever raises the critical issues, which is always what's happening underground and our lack of ability to kind of consider the city in 3 dimensions. But one question, why have we got our utilities so out of control? Can anybody answer that from anywhere? You know, it seems like the constant problem.
I think it's a big question. I don't have a singular answer for it, and I'm happy for other people who are on the call to join in and try and attempt to respond. It's a combination of nationally significant infrastructure having confidentiality aspects, and I've personally worked on a project where we to the best of our ability, surveyed the site, and in the early stages of an inquiry, we had to change our design because there was a piece of significant infrastructure that no one was meant to know about, but was a reality and influenced our design. Didn't make us look great in front of the planning inspectorate, but there was no other way that would have been known. And just on that point, I've got a really nice quote from a book that was written in 2009 by Jeff Minna, it's called the Building Blog Book, and it describes the mysterious tunnels that don't officially exist below London, but to leave definite question marks on the surface. Beyond that, I think there's a lot of proprietary data that's held by individual organisations. There's also times where organisations go through fundamental changes. If we look at the precursor to the GLA, there's bits of titles of land, there's sections of land and bits of utility that no one knows who owns it. The main thing is that we're having this discussion and we're starting to haul together all those analog pieces of data with the digital ones. But there is a real question about who owns data, who has access to it. And these are some of the questions that the Geospatial Commission are looking at.
Okay, thank you. I guess another question leading on from that is kind of like who owns the data, what data is also the quality standards for data. And there was a question from Lee Haycoop about, will there be a quality standard for data? And Lee, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe explain a bit more what you were asking?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Yes, so I've noticed this. In fact, this morning I was listening to Andy Haldane from the Bank of England talking about data that had been selected to say that the economic recovery had happened in 2018 and we were all better now, whereas in fact, only by chance, because he talked to charities, he found that this wasn't the case in lots of areas of the UK. He sent his team back to look more at the data, and and they looked at it in a different way and said, yeah, this is true. The economic recovery has not happened in Northwest and Northeast Scotland, Southwest, East Anglia, Wales, and so on, which is incredible, isn't it? And I notice on the propensity to mapping tool, which is having an absolute direct effect on what green infrastructure is, comes to the foremost for our here in Sheffield. That Uden is a tiny little village, and yet the propensity to travel is very high. So how does that work out? You know, what was behind it? Has somebody with a very narrow mind not really understood that, you know, maybe there are people who are cycling to work in the local pub and they're not, and they don't need a green infrastructure route, which is what I'm interested in. So there should be some quality standards behind data. Who's going to be that organization that assures that? How could it be done across so many different kinds of data sets? That's my question.
Okay, thank you very much. Any thoughts from the speakers, or anyone wants to come in on that?
Hi, yeah, I think that's a really important point, that it's not just, the planning white paper only talks about planning data, things like spatial policies on a map, or what sort of land uses or application decisions. But actually these are obviously part of a much bigger ecosystem of data in the country as a whole. And I was looking at the website for the Centre for Public Data recently, and they were making a really important point that data collection is really hard. It's expensive, it takes time, and it doesn't happen by accident. And that the most high quality public data sets, things like air quality, all have a very strong legal underpinning for it. So all of the kind of good things that the white paper is suggesting will only happen if there's a very clear legal framework for that, and things like, you know, licensing, which everybody knows is a bit of a nightmare in data at the moment, needs to be clarified. And the other point about interoperability, we've got all these data sets on planning, but also data sets on data involved with creating models of buildings, BIM models, you've got traffic models, you've got land use models, energy models. All of these models tend to be about individual things, but when we're talking about quality of life in cities and our experience of cities, that all tends to happen in the bits of cities that don't get models. That happens on the pavements, the frontages, the interfaces between those things. You know, we model roads in a lot of detail because they're expensive. We model buildings in lots of detail, but we're still struggling, I think, to evolve a data standard for really getting to grips with those bits in between. And I can go on about that for some time, but I better stop just there. So those were the 2 points on data.
Katja, could I just come back to one point under the attitude towards digital future for planning? You mentioned about the need for educating the public and so on. I kind of challenge the need for concentrating on educating the public, the committees and planning officers in 3D, because I think it's up to developers and their agents to use 3D modelling to clearly communicate the proposals, to engage better with communities, to develop the proposals from the site from an early stage, and to ensure that planning committees fully understand the reality of what is being proposed. In fact, a 3D modelling effect should allow one to see what something is going to be like before it's built. We have programs on television at the moment where people are having their kitchens designed, and they can walk into their kitchens and see what they look like before they commit themselves to building a kitchen. Yeah, we should be able to do this more in the public domain. And I think as regards cities, and to me, cities, it's about what I call the interplay of buildings and spaces, and certainly ties in with what Chris was saying, really.
Yeah. Thanks, Leslie, for that. Just to come back on that, I mean, I totally agree that, I mean, we need to get better in communicating the proposals. I guess partly what I was thinking, and that might be slightly cynical, is that I'm very aware that a 3D model can be manipulated quite easily to show something from a slightly, you know, and so is data. I think we just need to...
No, but if it's a properly constructed 3D model using the right software, there's no kidology. It's not like the old days when a developer would produce a very nice, convincing perspective and leave the nasty bits out. Properly used 3D modeling should be an honest.
Yeah.
Can I just one little point? I don't like to take advantage of, you know, crises and economic crises and so on, but if we're talking about actually collecting data, keeping data, you know, all those things that are normally expensive. Is there a sort of green job stimulus here that, you know, government's looking for job opportunities? Is this one that needs to be grasped because there's an opportunity that could actually make progress in this area?
Yeah, very good. Anyone want to?
Just one point on the digital modelling, Katja. Also referring to some of the comments that are coming up in the chat box there. I work regularly with local authorities. Sometimes I'm the one submitting an application through for an infrastructure project. Sometimes I'm working, let's say, on the side of the local authority to determine applications. Within London, there's been quite a high take-up of a program called ViewCity, which is a 3D visualization tool, and quite a few local authority councils are finding that a quite useful way of interrogating new proposals and getting a true understanding of what they could look like on the ground. But that sits at the opposite end of the spectrum to, as some of the comments have said, local authorities have been woefully underfunded and under-resourced in terms of IT. And we've all experienced that the hard way through having to rapidly work remotely. The only other thing I would add is we often have, sorry, someone might need to mute themselves. We also have a challenge when people submit planning applications that you can only break things into parts less than 5 meg, and there's limits on resolution, and you have these huge documents broken into tiny, tiny pieces. So there are certainly aspects at the moment of data management that aren't working in one planning department, but on the other hand, they're using quite sophisticated software. So it's just interesting to see how that's going to shape up.
Yes, yeah. I think that might be a good point. I was trying to get Justin from Connected Place Catapult, and maybe he can share some of his experience of helping use data.
Hi, thanks. And I just want to say thanks to Elizabeth for shouting out some of the work that we did way back when on the Iceberg project. I actually have joined this as a participant, so I haven't prepared anything, but in terms of, we've led quite a lot of work with a lot of councils and central government on delivering digital tools for planning. And we call it PlanTech, but a lot of the concepts that are being discussed, I think, in the chat, but also being raised, I think they're really valid. Things like LiDAR and is 3D modeling the right thing, and should we be looking at BIM? And I think the key here is trying to understand that, one, we need to fix the plumbing first so that authorities can actually handle data and understand what to do with it. And we're talking about planners. They're not educated in data management or what data is. So we need to upskill ourselves as urban designers, as urban planners, and as practitioners in the industry. And I think there's a lot of conversation that the RTPI is having around helping to upskill students in universities to work in these sorts of fields. And the second thing that is key is that it's not, someone asked the question, so who's going to fund all this work, and how local authorities find the money for these sorts of things? And I think what's key to remember is that the tools and the products that are starting to come forward and that should come forward as part of the response in the white paper need to be things that are scalable, so that everyone can be using it, so that it's not proprietary within one council, but also that they are that they're collaborative, because essentially everyone's facing the same problem. All authorities across the UK, across England, will be facing the same problem in being able to handle this, and it's going to cost each authority, if every single authority or every single group went and delivered their own thing, it'll cost them over £100,000 each to deliver it. So there's a real push here for collaborative and consortium style efforts to deliver these sorts of things. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Justin.
Can I just say one thing? One of the points I made in the article I wrote in Urban Realm was that, in fact, this will save councils time, and which will save them money and save them resources. That small scheme that I showed on that video involved a lot of planning inquiries, a lot of planning time, far in excess of and it could have been avoided if 3D CAD modelling had been used in the way certainly that I perceive it, and which it's used by a lot of designers.
Thank you, Leslie. I think I want to move and I think to another question, which I think fits in quite well, and that's a question from Phil Smith, and maybe you can unmute yourself and elaborate a little bit. You've asked the question of how far down the settlement hierarchy would we expect to model in 3D? And that's something I was thinking earlier as well. We've been talking about cities, but what about new settlements and landscapes? So Phil, if you could please elaborate on your question. Are you there? Okay, he might not be there. So,
Katja, sorry.
Oh, you are.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I was struggling to unmute there. Yeah, I work for two relatively small local authorities. We've got lots of small towns and villages and some pretty creaky IT infrastructure. So I can imagine this is going to be an absolutely massive challenge for a lot of local authorities, which potentially are going to be going through local government reform as well if all that happens. So the upheaval could be huge, and we've got a very short timescale potentially that the government set for us in terms of the timetable to get our new local plans in place, all the digital platforms and so on. So to me at the moment, it seems like a massive hill to climb. I can't quite see how we're going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Does anyone on the panel have maybe a positive message to that of how that can happen? And I think I'm particularly interested in villages and the kind of countryside and how we deal with them.
There's plenty. Producing terrain models is not difficult. Some authorities produce terrain models and then implant the different types of housing schemes into them. I don't see a problem. I feel positive about the whole process.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess we need to kind of...
it needs to be daunting at all.
I guess we also need to kind of, you know, embrace not just the modeling, but also the wider data sets that were mentioned that inform the local plan delivery, like the kind of all the GIS data, the flooding information, and you really, is there anything anyone wants to add about the early stages of the plan process? We've talked quite a bit about actually, you know, development, applications and proposals, but what about the very early stages when we actually kind of decide which land is identified for growth or renewal or for protection?
Sorry, I'm talking a lot, but that's the point at which it should be used, and it isn't being used. If it was used at earlier stages, the whole process would benefit.
Okay. So, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of was the origin of this idea of the land use framework, where we can draw all the necessary information together, including, I get really concerned, I won't start off about the Oxford-Cambridge arc, but I get really concerned when you can see that development is being pushed for economic reasons in the absence of other resources that are critical, like the water companies tearing their hair out about providing water for people. And sort of lack of proper infrastructure, and we don't do we need to build new infrastructure, you know, at great cost. There are a lot of places that would actually benefit from sort of some additional development and linking jobs and so on, but we don't take enough factors into account in our decision making. So we head off on one set of sort of issues like, hey, economic development, that's what we need. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge tech companies could go all over the country. Why can't they go north? You know, they don't have to be where they are. So I think we're just not being holistic enough in our thinking and identifying sufficient kind of economic, social, cultural, all those issues at the time when we make so-called development decisions on very narrow sort of parameters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an issue that comes up again and again, that we are missing that national land use framework where we can rebalance housing growth versus the economy, with a job, all those elements. And I mean, we've been talking about using data to, I guess, illustrate, inform proposals, but is there a way, I mean, can we be using data in a more innovative way in kind of developing new processes in terms of using data to model scenarios about what happens if we push growth in the north of England, and how does it, so actually using data to inform our decision making in a much more creative way. Well,
creative way, and also at the cheaper end, you know, it's like when you asked to design a building, you know, the speculation at the front of what you might do and could do is much cheaper than finding you've done the wrong thing. So, you know, there's a kind of positive benefit from you know, doing your scenarios and looking at the what ifs before you make some of those rather terminal decisions that we seem to rush into.
Absolutely, yeah. Does anyone want to kind of, any comments on that, on the kind of more strategic kind of use of data and more kind of creative uses of data to inform our decision making in the...
Yeah, I think the plans as they stand, where there will be a standardized way of describing policies across the whole of the country, will make that much easier. It will make that sort of simulation much more easier, and it will also, the data that accumulates over time of monitoring what happens can also feed into those simulations and validate the models to look at things in future. But to answer Phil's point, I think, and others who are talking about the problem of resources, I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a sort of sometimes a tendency when talking about software to think that it's somehow magic, and you know, we talk about the cloud a lot, and the cloud doesn't exist. It's a big warehouse outside London or in Amsterdam. There's no such thing as the cloud. But so people start to think that this isn't going to cost anything. But all this talk about digital doesn't change the fundamentals of how the system works, the principles of citizenship, democracy, funding, skills. All these things are still just as relevant as they always were. So I think that's something that sometimes gets missed when we get too excited about software. So yeah, I think funding is critical, and clarity from governments as well about what the standards are and what the expectations are for what local plans need to be in terms of data formats. That's also very important.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I want to kind of bring it to a subject we haven't discussed, well, a little bit, but just bring it back to that and the kind of community engagement, how to really bring people into this. I mean, Leslie talked about that. There are two questions, and one is from Peter Baker and then from Flick Harris. And I ask you in a minute to elaborate. And Peter's asking, is there really sufficient commitment to true community engagement at local plan stage for the digital techniques to be developed? And then Flick Harris is asking, how does access for disabled people fit in with the design standards and the use of also the kind of digital tools I expect? So could Peter, do you want to elaborate on your question a little bit?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yes, I mean, I work with communities on neighbourhood plans quite a bit, and I think the early stages of this planning reform, the local plans ought to be not just setting zones and determining how many houses go where, but doing urban design appraisals really of the local areas. And neighbourhood forums would be good at doing that, but obviously it needs a lot of public engagement and a lot of resources put into that to get some idea of where development needs to go because of the existing qualities of the place. And I think that's going to be very difficult to actually encourage people to get involved in issues that aren't very specific at that stage. So I just wondered how digital technology can actually help in doing that.
Okay, thank you. Anyone want to?
Certainly in Edinburgh, there was a review of where people, local communities would like to see development, but where they'd like to see development bore no relation to where development's really happening, because a lot of it's to do with who owns the land, and who owns the land tends to, and who has the money to develop the land tends to be where the power is. And certainly in the UK, I think there's less of a spirit of community than perhaps in Scandinavian countries. And I think, although in Scotland we have the planning bill which says that community have to be more involved in what's happening in their area. It's really how can this happen? You know, that's a question that's yet to be faced.
Sue?
Yeah, I think Leslie's really touched on a really interesting thing. I think in the planning white paper, did they say they wanted the unheard to be heard? Was a kind of phrase. So with my hat on when I do sort of eco-build, future build seminars, we endlessly talk about co-design, community engagement, how to involve communities and so on. And then what often comes up is finding the community. I mean, I'm sitting here in Oxford. It would be really hard to get a kind of community enthusiasm for almost anything that's going on in terms of, you know, building developments here. I can't kind of quite imagine what my neighbors would just look blankly at me if I tried to discuss it. So for me, the question is, you know, how do we actually find the community, find a way in which to engage the community, and how do we help these unheard to be heard, and what are we encouraging them to hear about? So if anybody's got the answer to how you actually get really positive community engagement, I think there are a whole lot of us who would be very pleased to know more about it.
Yes, and I think let's open this question up. Anyone in the, in the room, we don't have to stick to our speakers. You can come in and bring in your expertise as well. Put up your hand or let me know if you want to speak. But I think, Flick Harris, you made a comment about community and making it sure that the community can initiate change. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I was just making a point, but I sent it privately to Robert because he sent me a message. But I think when the strategic framework was in Greater Manchester was being consulted on, there was some quite good consultation with the voluntary and community sector, and that brought together a number of sectors, some groups that are very involved in pedestrianisation, in pedestrian rights, and a lot of people involved with local geographical areas, groups that are involved in equality and diversity and so on. And I do agree with somebody that did say it takes a lot of time to do that. And I think the planning authorities seem to have kind of abandoned that a little bit because perhaps because they haven't got the staff available, the skills may not be there, and so on. So it is a really important element, and I've been trying to get my head around, and thank you everybody for fantastic information presentations, but how digitalization can help that. And I definitely like the idea of 3D modeling, which I know was used in New Islington area in North Manchester a few years ago. I think the universities were involved in that. I don't think that the developers are thinking about it, and the planning authority probably doesn't have the resources, but the universities may do, and they could perhaps work with local authorities to help with that. I don't know. But yes, I mean, as you can see from my questions, I'm really involved with access issues. And at the moment, it's very much about buildings and the immediate environment. But Joan Rutherford is on this call as well. She's done loads of work around housing, and we're both involved with ageing issues as well. So, the importance of neighbourhoods are important, and then accessing older people to engage with them is quite complex, I think, because they're not naturally involved in community groups. But so I haven't got any answers really. I'm just raising some issues.
I think that's what most of us are doing at the moment. We are exploring the issues and the opportunities. Thank you for that. And I think there's one really important point that you made is also linking it back to Sue's comment that the white paper says we want to reach the people who are currently not regularly reached, and stats have shown that online engagement, digital tools, apps do tend to reach a younger kind of population that often isn't reached at the moment. But I think we can't lose sight of the older generations as well that might not be that adapt to using kind of digital tools. So I think we just have to make sure that we are not kind of losing what we have to create and attract comments from younger communities. I'm just looking through the questions here, and I think one question that has come up is, who else do we need to draw in? I mean, we are talking as planners, designers, architects here. What are the other professions, the other skills, the other specialists that we need to kind of enforce our collaboration with to make this happen and turn into something positive? I don't know, Liz, you've just turned up on my screen. Is that something you want to come?
Oh no, I think there's always a bit of a lag. No, I was just going to comment on the chat in the chat. Helen Evans has talked, which I think is a very important issue about the unheard being heard, is barriers to digital accessibility as well, whether it's a lack of skill, but also a lack of physical equipment. The cost of having a decent computer, having access to the internet is beyond some people. And just also to say that although I'm quite supportive of some of the digital changes to the development consent planning process, I also still like a really simple sign on a post, on a lamppost. I know it's simple, but it's democratic, it's visible, and you don't require technology to get on board. Even if after that point you're then needing to use a website to look at a proposal, at least you're immediately aware of it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of issues of equity as well as access in these digital tools that need to be considered.
One important factor which hasn't been mentioned, I don't think, and I don't know how prevalent this is south of the border, I'm in Scotland, in Edinburgh, is the importance of community councils. Community councils are consultees, certainly in my area, and in Edinburgh we have, I think, 42 community councils, and they become hubs for people to go to find out what's happening in their area. They all have their own websites. And they have walk-in sessions, so people who are perhaps disenfranchised or don't have access to the equipment you mentioned can find out what's happening. I think there's too much emphasis, to my mind anyway, on this idea that planning say, well, if you want to know what's happening, you go onto our website. Well, people have got other things to do on a Saturday morning than say, oh, I think I'll go on the website and find out what's happening in my area. And I believe quite strongly in the importance of urban centres, such as you have in Milan, where you can go there, you can find out everything that's happening in your city, you can ask questions. There's a lack of that sort of thing, that level of communication.
Okay.
Can I also just jump in for a sec after Leslie? Just when we're talking about the border divide, I think first of all, the first thing to say is that the Scottish government's actually quite forward thinking in its digital planning approach. It's actually set out a digital planning strategy. So, and they've started to move forward. So I sort of just want to link in with that. And another thing that you identified in terms of the discussion about whether we should be looking at lampposts or digital engagement, and do we lock people out? There's a real validity in thinking about all the different ways of reaching all different sorts of people. But the key, and Leslie slightly hit on it when he said, oh, no one has time on their Saturday to start looking at websites. But not only that, they don't even understand what they're looking at. It's so complicated. Like the relationship between a building height and if you chopped off one story and whether that impacts on, say, Section 106 or new open spaces, etc. People don't understand those sorts of relationships. And if we use digital tools to help them communicate with local authorities, communicate with planning officers, to be able to understand, oh, look, I don't like that being 6 stories, but I understand that if it was 5, I don't like it, but the 6 stories means that we can afford to get a little bit of money out of the developer to then pay for new facilities in the neighborhood. I'll be willing to live with that. And that's the sort of thing we need to think about as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think the complexities, I mean, that is something that is the most difficult thing to communicate, and the trade-offs that planning has to make at the moment. And I think it links to, I want to come back to one point from Martina Javara, which I think is really important, and it's an opportunity of this data-driven approach, that she's saying data is dynamic. And so actually, if we are using a kind of online platform, so there's nothing stopping us that local plans are being permanently and constantly updated, rather than fixing them for a time frame and sticking to them. And that adds obviously, again, to the complexities. Martina, do you want to come unmute yourself and explain a little bit more what you were thinking?
Yes, I think that this would be eventually the most significant change. I don't think it will be sort of from day one, you know, the week after the white paper is published, but because the nature of data is changing significantly, the platforms are changing, the ability to scale, to have workable sizes of documents, etc., changes, but also the collection, the data collection happens on a more regular basis. So in my view, the plan will have different aspects, or this is my guess, you know, of the future. One part of it will be constantly being updated as new, you know, the new census data comes in, new transport data comes in, and therefore some parts of the planning will be always on the making. And then there will be some big items, some big areas of change that are driven by vision, not by data. And that will be the one that has a period. And I believe that in time it will help also the consultation side, because instead of consulting on all sorts of issues in a 500 pages local plan, one would consult in the big areas of change. And I think this is the big opportunity of this, of the framework set out in the white paper, the fact that it says some parts of it will be also centralized, you know, there will be standard or a menu of standard policies. And then there is really the opportunity to focus on what matters locally, what is making a local, significant local change, and that is driven by choices.
Yeah.
And the rest would somehow be more automated than now and monitored. And maybe we will have a dashboard where we see the progression of development, the number of jobs created, the number of houses, etc. The trajectories will all be semi-automated. So we will be able to concentrate on what matters. That's my view and hope.
Okay. Thank you very much, Martina. Does anyone from the panel want to come back to it? I mean, it's a different level, but it strikes me that that's one of the issues on a more detailed level also with the utilities, that we can't get to grips with that because it's a permanently, constantly changing environment under our streets and spaces.
Can I just go back a step? Yeah. You're saying what other professions and people should we engage with? I think some of the most interesting work's going on with the urban geographers. You know, some of the work that people like Paul Chatterton are doing, or Jenny Pickerel. I think there's that whole social kind of geographic engagement. I also think some of the work that psychology, you know, people like Rhiannon Corcoran are doing,
yeah,
is important. And also I think some of the sort of heritage and cultural historians have actually got a lot to teach us. So, you know, we don't want to be too myopic in who actually the players are, because there's some surprising people out there that we might not have thought of who actually really seriously contribute to what would make better places.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yes, yeah. Okay. We are actually coming up to the end of this session. And I just want to really give all the speakers a kind of final opportunity to sum up their thoughts and maybe kind of highlighting the key issues, challenges, opportunities that the kind of use of digital data might provide, and how it will happen, how it will help us to create the kind of better places that we all desire. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first, as ever. So, well, I think everything all sorts of people have said have shown that it opens lots of opportunities. So how do we, but there is no money, the government has no money. How do we press for the investment? We've got hard-pressed local authorities. Are we asking them to do more? Are we asking central government to take more responsibility? You know, how do we pressed for that kind of investment that would deliver these huge benefits if only we could get it off the ground.
Thank you very much. Leslie?
I think the benefits will, I think it'll pay for itself, basically. I think the benefits will outweigh any concerns. I don't have a lot more to add, really.
Okay, thank you, that's fine. Don't have to. Elizabeth?
Oh, I'm not too sure how to wrap up. I do share Sue's resourcing concerns, but it's also good to hear Leslie's optimism. And I think if we look at the pressure on various government departments, they're all being encouraged to be quite entrepreneurial. They're being forced to fund themselves, and from that, I think we'll see some lean, costed products. Yeah, it's a tricky one going forward, but I think that whatever we do need to underpin that question of equity and transparency as well. I think is just really important.
Thank you very much. And Chris?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I don't have that much to add, really. I think the question of funding is critical, and hopefully there'll be a lot of help from central government to clarify the standards and what's needed. And hopefully the fact that software companies won't need to reinvent the wheel with every local authority may lead to savings across the country as a whole, which may make these things more feasible. But as always, we need to wait for the detail.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think this was a fascinating session, and I've been trying to keep an eye also on the chat, and I would recommend anyone to kind of save the chat, because there are a lot of really useful links in there to data sets that already exist, to examples of what people are already doing, and contact details, links, etc. And I mean, as far as I can take it away, that I think everybody is pretty much convinced that this is an opportunity and can actually kind of help and be very beneficial. And in terms of engaging with people, explaining what we are doing and explaining proposals. But there are a lot of challenges in terms of who's collecting the data, who owns it, how is it updated, in particular in the light of kind of underfunded local authorities as well, and the investment that needs to bring. And I think it clearly comes out quite strongly that we do need consistency across the country. And that would be one of the main kind of, I guess, savings, and make it easy for people to access that data. I think we all need to learn and become aware, because only because it's data doesn't mean it's right, or doesn't mean it's up to date, or doesn't mean it reflects the right image. So I think as we have all learned to be mindful of, the news on the internet might not necessarily reflect the reality or the truth, that we all have to become also critical and data savvy of assessing data and being able to judge which data is good data, up-to-date data, and which data might not be that good or helpful. So I think there's a long way to go for us, but I think it's really good to hear that everybody thinks it's a positive step and a helpful step. So just want to kind of really tell you about next week, because this was the second one in a series of 4 events to explore the white paper. Next week, we will be talking about design code and design guidance. And the week after that, we will be really kind of bringing together the thoughts from the urban design community, and that will help formulate the UDG's response to the white paper. As a reminder to everyone, the white paper deadline is on the 29th of October. We have heard there are lots of thoughts, lots of ideas, so I would recommend everybody kind of getting back and putting their thoughts into this process, because it has been mentioned several times, the devil is in the detail, and we need to really make sure that we get that detail right, and the government gets this detail right, so we can get the benefits from this quite significant change to our planning system. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sue, and Liz. Thanks for your contributions. Thank you for all the participants. We had a really good audience and a lot of good comments. So hopefully see you next week. Thank you very much.